The silence was the loudest sound in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 1,000 of New York's elite, dressed in bespoke suits and shimmering gowns, held their collective breath. On stage, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight, stood Jack Gallagher, the city's golden boy, a titan of industry about to deliver the keynote speech at the annual Legacy Gala. But no words came out. His mouth was slightly agape, his $1,000,000 smile frozen into a grotesque mask of shock. His eyes were locked on a figure near the entrance, a ghost from his past made gloriously impossibly real. And as every head in that cavernous hall turned to follow his gaze, they saw her, his ex-wife Autumn Langford, looking radiant, poised, and standing on the arm of the one man in the city more powerful than Jack himself. 3 years. It had been 1,095 days since Autumn Langford had last seen Jack Gallagher in person. She had counted them at first as a prisoner counts the marks on a cell wall. Each day was a small victory, a reclaiming of the air he had sucked out of every room they ever shared. Now the counting had stopped. Her life was her own, a quiet but sturdy structure she had built from the rubble of their marriage. Her small architecture firm, Langford Designs, operated out of a sun-drenched loft in Soho that smelled of fresh coffee and blueprint paper. It was a far cry from the opulent, sterile penthouse on Park Avenue she'd once called home. That home had felt like a museum curated by Jack, where she was just another beautiful, silent exhibit. Here, surrounded by her drafts, her models of sustainable housing, and her 2 loyal employees, she was the curator, the artist, and the architect of her own existence. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, thick and creamy, the kind of cardstock that felt heavy with importance. The insignia of the Metropolitan Legacy Gala was embossed in gold. It was the most exclusive, high-profile charity event of the year, a convergence of old money and new power. Autumn had stared at it for a long time, her finger tracing the elegant script. She hadn't received an invitation like this since the divorce. In Jack's world, she had been a fixture at these events. In her own, she was a relative unknown. She almost threw it away. The thought of stepping back into that glittering, judgmental world was nauseating. It was a world of shark-like smiles and whispered condemnations, a world where Jack reigned supreme. He would undoubtedly be there. Worse, he was slated as the keynote speaker. His company, Apex Dynamics, was the primary sponsor. His face had been on the cover of Forbes last month, his smirking, handsome features unavoidable. The article praised him as a visionary, a self-made man who turned ambition into an empire. It conveniently omitted that his self-made journey had been paved with her sacrifice career, her inheritance, and her spirit. She was about to slide the invitation into the recycling bin when her phone chimed. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, but the message was polite and direct. "Ms. Langford, this is Desmond Hawthorn. I do hope my invitation reached you. I would be honored if you would consider attending the Legacy Gala as my personal guest. There is a project I am deeply passionate about that I believe would be a perfect fit for your unique vision. Please allow me to discuss it with you. D.H." Autumn's breath hitched. Desmond Hawthorn. He wasn't just a billionaire. He was the billionaire. A reclusive, silver-haired philanthropist in his late 60s, Hawthorn was a legend in the world of art and architecture. His portfolio wasn't filled with soulless glass towers, but with beautifully restored historical buildings, innovative public spaces, and museums that breathed life into the cities they occupied. He was a kingmaker, a man whose patronage could turn a small, ambitious firm like hers into a global name overnight. He knew of her work, her unique vision. For years, Jack had called her architectural designs quaint hobbies and unrealistic fantasies. He had convinced her that her focus on integrating nature and community into urban spaces was naive and unprofitable. Yet here was Desmond Hawthorn, a man who built legacies, not just buildings seeking her out. The decision was no longer about Jack. It was about her. It was a test. Could she walk back into the lion's den, not as Jack Gallagher's discarded wife, but as Autumn Langford, an architect worthy of Desmond Hawthorn's attention? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a familiar phantom from her past life. But beneath it a tiny, defiant flame flickered. For 3 years she had been rebuilding. Maybe it was time to see just how strong the foundation was. She typed her reply, her fingers steady. "Mr. Hawthorn, I would be delighted. Thank you for the invitation." As she hit send, she looked at the scale model of a community library she was designing for a low-income neighborhood in the Bronx. It was a project with no budget and no glamour, but it was filled with light green spaces and hope. It was filled with everything Jack had told her was worthless, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever created. To understand why a man like Jack Gallagher would freeze on the grandest stage of his life, you had to understand the marriage he had systematically dismantled. It hadn't started with cruelty. It had started with a seductive, all-consuming charm. Autumn met him when she was a promising graduate student in architecture at Columbia, and he was a junior analyst with an ambition that burned so brightly it was blinding. He saw her, truly saw her, or so she thought. He praised her designs, calling her a poet who wrote in glass and steel. He made her believe they were a team, a power couple destined to take over the world. The first crack appeared subtly. He started helping with her presentations. Just a few tweaks to make it more palatable for the money men, darling, he'd say, his hands gently guiding hers on the mouse. His tweaks often stripped the soul from her designs, replacing her innovative community-focused elements with more conventional profit-driven features. When a professor praised the commercial viability of her revised project, Jack squeezed her hand under the table, whispering, "See, we did it. We." As his career at the investment firm skyrocketed, their world became his world. Their friends became his colleagues. Their dinners became his networking opportunities. Her work, the passion that had once defined her, was relegated to the spare bedroom. It became her little hobby. "Why bother with these small-time contests, Autumn?" he'd ask, gesturing dismissively at a model she'd spent weeks perfecting. "You don't need to work. I'm building an empire for us." The emotional corrosion was slow, a steady drip of condescension that wore down her confidence. He'd interrupt her at dinner parties to clarify her points. He'd buy her clothes he thought were more suitable for the wife of a rising star, gently pushing her own more artistic style to the back of the closet. He managed their finances, giving her a generous allowance as if she were a child, despite the fact that her own family inheritance had been the seed money for his first major investment. He never raised his voice. He never had to. His disappointment was a weapon wielded with surgical precision. The final, unforgivable act came 5 years into the marriage. It was the moment the foundation of her life didn't just crack, but shattered. Autumn had been named one of 5 finalists for the prestigious Viridian Prize, a career-making grant to design a new sustainable arts center in Chicago. It was the culmination of everything she believed in. For months, she poured her soul into the project, working late into the night in her small studio, feeling a flicker of her old self returning. Jack was outwardly supportive, but in a patronizing way. "That's wonderful, sweetie. It's good to keep yourself busy." The final presentation was on a Friday morning via a secure video conference with the judging panel. She had rehearsed for days. Her digital files were triple backed up on her laptop, a hard drive, and a cloud service. On Thursday night, Jack insisted on taking her out for a celebratory dinner. To my brilliant wife, he toasted, his smile as bright and empty as ever. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you'll always be a winner to me." The next morning, she woke up feeling groggy. He'd been generous with the wine, she recalled. She went to her laptop to do one last run-through. The presentation file was gone. Not just on the laptop, but from the external drive and the cloud account as well. A frantic search revealed nothing. It was as if it had never existed. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She called the IT support for the cloud service, her voice trembling. After an hour on the phone with a sympathetic but helpless technician, the truth emerged. The files had been permanently deleted from a logged-in device at 3:17 a.m., and the deletion was followed by a complete wipe of the account's recovery cache. It wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate, methodical sabotage. There was only one other person who had the passwords. She confronted him in the living room, her laptop clutched in her hands like a shield. He was already dressed in his impeccable suit, sipping an espresso, looking out over the city. "It was you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You deleted my project." He didn't turn around at first. He just watched the morning traffic snake along the avenues below. Then he sighed, a long, theatrical sound of weary patience. He turned to face her, his expression not of guilt, but of gentle paternalistic concern. "Autumn, I did it for you. For us," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I saw how much pressure you were under. What if you didn't win? The disappointment would have crushed you. And that panel? They're ruthless. They would have torn your ideas apart. You're a sensitive soul, my love. I couldn't bear to see you get hurt." He took a step towards her, his arms open for an embrace. "This way it's not a failure. It's a technical difficulty. An unfortunate accident. You can hold your head high. You don't need their validation, Autumn. You have me." In that moment, Autumn saw him for what he was. Not a protector, but a saboteur. Not a partner, but a warden. His success didn't just require her support. It required her failure. Her light had to be extinguished so his could shine brighter unopposed. The love she thought she had for him curdled into something cold and hard in her chest. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned, walked into the bedroom, and packed a single bag. 2 weeks later, her lawyer served him with divorce papers. The battle was brutal. He used his army of high-priced attorneys to paint her as unstable and ungrateful, trying to bleed her dry. But the one thing he could never account for was the quiet, steely resolve he himself had forged in her. She walked away with only a fraction of what she was owed, but she walked away with her freedom. She walked away to start counting the days. 1,095 of them. The night of the gala, a cool autumn breeze swept through Manhattan, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and exhaust fumes. Autumn stood before the full-length mirror in her modest apartment, a place Jack had never seen. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had left him 3 years ago. Her hair was still the same warm honey blonde, but she wore it in a simple, elegant chignon, instead of the elaborate styles Jack's society stylists had insisted upon. Her eyes, which had often been clouded with a kind of weary resignation, were clear and direct. Her dress was not from a Parisian couture house. It was a discovery from a young independent designer, a deep emerald green silk that fell in a clean architectural line to the floor. It was understated yet powerful, a sheath of quiet confidence. It was a dress she had chosen for herself. A town car sent by Desmond Hawthorn was waiting downstairs. As she rode towards the Metropolitan Museum, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver. The old fear, that familiar ghost, whispered at the edges of her mind. She saw Jack's face, his look of pitying disappointment. She heard his voice telling her she was out of her depth. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on the weight of the portfolio case resting on her lap. It contained preliminary sketches for a project she had been working on, a dream project. It was her armor. The car pulled up to the grand floodlit steps of the Met. A river of black town cars deposited a glittering stream of people into the warm glow of the entrance. The air buzzed with money power and the flash of paparazzi cameras. Autumn's heart hammered against her ribs. Just as she stepped out of the car, another pulled up behind hers. Desmond Hawthorn emerged, looking every bit the patrician gentleman he was. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and his tailored tuxedo fit him with an easy grace. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, crinkled at the corners as he smiled at her. "Autumn?" he said, his voice a warm, gentle baritone. "You look magnificent. The color reminds me of a malachite carving I once saw at the Hermitage. Absolutely stunning." There was no fawning, no false flattery. Just a simple, genuine appreciation that immediately put her at ease. He offered her his arm, and his touch was light but steady. "Shall we?" Walking up those steps on his arm was like parting the Red Sea. The whispers started instantly. Desmond Hawthorn rarely attended public events, and when he did, he always came alone. His appearance with a beautiful unknown woman was an event in itself. The photographers who had barely glanced her way now swarmed, their flashes popping like fireworks. "Mr. Hawthorn, who is your companion?" "A stunning new partner, Desmond." He simply smiled, patting Autumn's hand reassuringly. "A brilliant colleague," he said to one persistent reporter, his voice carrying easily over the din. Inside the great hall was a breathtaking spectacle. Towering floral arrangements reached towards the vaulted ceilings, and the sound of a string quartet echoed off the ancient stone. Waiters in white jackets moved silently through the throng, offering champagne and canapes. And everywhere there were faces. Faces Autumn recognized from newspapers and society pages. Faces that had once looked through her as if she were made of glass. Tonight they weren't looking through her. They were looking at her. She saw Beatrice Vandergrift, a woman who had once publicly corrected Autumn's pronunciation of a French designer's name, now staring with wide, inquisitive eyes. She saw Robert Calloway, a banking magnate who had always addressed his comments to Jack, even when Autumn asked the question, now nodding at her with a look of newfound respect. They didn't see Autumn, the timid wife. They saw the woman on the arm of Desmond Hawthorn. It was a bitter, illuminating pill to swallow. Their respect wasn't for her, not yet. It was for her proximity to power. But it was a start. Desmond navigated the room with an effortless charm, introducing her not as a date, but as an esteemed professional. "This is Autumn Langford of Langford Designs. Her work in sustainable urban architecture is going to change the way we think about city living." With every introduction, Autumn felt a bit of her old self, the confident and passionate student Jack had tried to bury, resurface. She found herself talking about her work, her voice growing stronger and more animated as she described her philosophy of creating spaces that serve communities. People were listening. They were engaged. She deliberately avoided looking for Jack. She knew he was here. She could feel his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. But she refused to let him be the center of her orbit tonight. This evening was not about him. It was about laying the first stone of her new future. As dinner was announced and the guests began to move towards the candlelit expanse of the Charles Engelhard Court, Desmond leaned in close. "Are you all right, my dear?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face. "This can be an intimidating arena." Autumn met his gaze and for the first time that night gave a genuine, unforced smile. "I'm better than all right, Desmond," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm ready." He smiled back, a look of true admiration in his eyes. "I know you are." They found their table a prime spot near the front with a clear view of the stage. The stage where in less than an hour Jack Gallagher was scheduled to give the most important speech of his career. Jack Gallagher felt the familiar, intoxicating buzz in his veins. It was a potent cocktail of adrenaline power and the absolute certainty of his own brilliance. He stood just behind the heavy velvet curtain backstage, looking out through a small gap at the glittering assembly. The Charles Engelhard Court was packed. Every major player in New York finance, tech, and media was out there, their faces upturned, waiting for him. Tonight was his coronation. Keynote speaker at the Legacy Gala wasn't just an honor. It was an anointing. It was the establishment acknowledging him not as a rising star, but as a fixed point in the firmament. His company Apex Dynamics had posted record profits. His book, The Predator's Mindset: Winning in a World Without Rules, was a bestseller. He was the man of the hour, the decade. He smoothed the lapels of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He had practiced his speech 100 times, honing every word, every pause, every gesture for maximum impact. It was a masterpiece of motivational rhetoric, weaving together tales of his own humble beginnings with aggressive take-no-prisoners business philosophy. It was about power control and the relentless pursuit of victory. It was the story of his life. His assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, approached him holding a bottle of water. 10 minutes, Mr. Gallagher. They're just finishing the dessert course." "Everything is set, Peter?" Jack asked without looking at him, his eyes still scanning the crowd. "Yes, sir." The teleprompter is loaded and synced. The lighting cues are confirmed. Your microphone is live tested. Good. Jack dismissed him with a flick of his wrist. He didn't need a teleprompter, not really. The words were etched into his soul. But it was part of the stagecraft, the illusion of effortless perfection, an illusion he had carefully constructed over the years. His gaze swept the front tables, ticking off the names and faces. The Chen brothers from Sovereign Wealth, Senator Michelson. Even Old Man Calloway, who had been a rival for years, was there looking sour. It filled Jack with a savage glee. He had beaten them all. And then he saw her. For a split second, his brain refused to process the image. It was like a computer glitch, a corrupted file. Autumn, sitting at a table directly in his line of sight. He blinked, expecting the mirage to vanish. But she remained. She was wearing a green dress he didn't recognize. Her hair was different. She looked poised, confident. A cold, unfamiliar sensation prickled at the back of his neck. He felt a flash of irritation. What was she doing here? This was his night, his world. She didn't belong here anymore. She had been excised, a failed component removed from the machine of his life. He scanned the table looking for her date. Probably some sad second-rate artist or a university professor she was trying to impress. It was pathetic, really. A transparent attempt to show him she had moved on. Then he saw the man sitting next to her. He was turned slightly, talking to someone at the adjacent table. Jack's irritation curdled into disbelief. It couldn't be. The man turned back towards Autumn, smiling, and the light caught his familiar profile, the shock of distinguished silver hair. Desmond Hawthorn. Jack felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Hawthorn. With Autumn. It made no sense. Hawthorn was a recluse, a living legend who operated on a plane of existence far above this glitzy scrum. He didn't just attend events, his presence shaped them. For him to be here with her, it was an anomaly, a tear in the fabric of the universe as Jack understood it. His mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe Hawthorne's usual companion had canceled last minute and a mutual acquaintance had foolishly set them up. A blind date. Yes, that had to be it. Autumn had probably bored him to tears all evening with her naive talk of community gardens and sustainable bamboo flooring. The old man was probably just being polite. But then he saw the way Hawthorne looked at her. It wasn't polite. It was engaged, attentive. There was a warmth in his eyes, a genuine respect that Jack, even in their best years, had never been able to fake. He watched as Hawthorne leaned in and said something, and Autumn laughed. It was a real laugh, not the tense, breathy sound she used to make when she was trying to please him. It was free, a hot, venomous jealousy, an emotion he hadn't felt in years coiled in his gut. It wasn't jealousy over the woman. He had discarded her after all. It was jealousy over the attention, Desmond Hawthorn's attention. It was a commodity more valuable than any stock in his portfolio. And Autumn, his failed, forgotten ex-wife, had it. 2 minutes, Mr. Gallagher, Peter whispered from the wings. Jack forced the image from his mind. He straightened his tie, the knot suddenly feeling tight around his throat. It didn't matter. It was a fluke, a statistical impossibility that meant nothing. In 2 minutes he would walk out onto that stage, and 1,000 people, including Hawthorne and Autumn, would be reminded of who the real power in the room was. He would deliver his speech, and the sheer force of his success would erase this bizarre, unsettling little scene from existence. He was Jack Gallagher, and he was about to own this night. He took a deep breath, the buzz returning sharper and more desperate now. He was in control. He was always in control. The master of ceremonies, a well-known news anchor with a voice as smooth as aged whiskey, strode to the podium. The gentle clinking of cutlery and the hum of conversation subsided. Ladies and gentlemen, the anchor began his smile, beaming out at the audience. Tonight we have been celebrating the legacy of this great city, a legacy built on vision and ambition. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, a man who embodies those very qualities. He is the founder and CEO of Apex Dynamics, a titan of modern finance, and the best-selling author of The Predator's Mindset. Please join me in giving a warm Legacy Gala welcome to the man of the hour, Mr. Jack Gallagher. A wave of thunderous applause swept the room. Backstage, Jack's own smile returned wide and brilliant. This was his moment. He strode from the wings into the blinding white spotlight, the applause washing over him like a physical force. He radiated confidence. He owned the stage. He walked to the sleek minimalist podium, placed his hands on either side, and surveyed the crowd, letting the applause die down naturally. He made eye contact with a few key people in the front rows, giving them a familiar conspiratorial nod. Finally, his eyes drifted as if by accident to Autumn's table. He looked directly at her, a flicker of a triumphant, pitying smirk on his lips. "See," the look said. "This is my world. You are just a spectator." Autumn met his gaze without flinching. Her expression was neutral calm. It unnerved him. He had expected to see awe or regret or even anger, but this placid self-possession was a language he didn't understand. He cleared his throat and began. "Thank you. Thank you. To be here tonight in this hallowed hall surrounded by the architects of our future, it's a profound honor." His voice was perfect, deep, resonant, and utterly commanding. The teleprompter scrolled with the words he knew by heart. "They say that legacy is not what you leave for people, but what you leave in people. It's about impact. It's about shaping the world to your will. It's about recognizing that in the jungle of modern commerce, you are either the predator or you are the prey." He was just hitting his stride, captivating the audience with his well-rehearsed blend of charisma and menace, when something unexpected happened. The master of ceremonies, who should have been seated, walked back onto the edge of the stage. He looked apologetic but firm. "Mr. Gallagher, my sincerest apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice amplified by a secondary microphone. "But we have a very special last-minute addition to our program. A patron who has been one of this institution's most steadfast and generous supporters has a significant announcement to make. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome to the stage Mr. Desmond Hawthorn." A new wave of applause, more respectful and somehow more significant than the one Jack had received, filled the hall. Jack was frozen at the podium. This wasn't on the schedule. He was the keynote, the main event. What was happening? Desmond Hawthorn rose from his table and walked to the stage with an unhurried, dignified gait. He didn't take the main podium, but stood beside a smaller lectern that a stagehand quickly put in place. He looked over at Jack and gave a polite, almost dismissive nod. "Thank you, Jack. I promise this will only take a moment," Desmond said, his quiet voice commanding more attention than Jack's practiced boom. He turned to the audience. "Legacy." Desmond began picking up Jack's own theme and infusing it with a different meaning. "It is not about predation. It is about creation. It is about building something beautiful and lasting that serves not just our own ambition, but our shared humanity." He paused, letting the words settle. For years, the Hawthorn Foundation has sought to invest in that kind of legacy, and tonight I am thrilled to announce our most ambitious project to date, the Hawthorn Wing for Architectural Innovation, to be built right here as a new addition to this magnificent museum. A collective gasp went through the audience. This was major news. A new wing at the Met was a generation-defining project. "This will not be just a building." Desmond continued, his passion evident. "It will be a living testament to a new way of thinking, a space that is sustainable, community-integrated, and that finds the poetry in function." To find a leader for such a project, we conducted a quiet, year-long international search for a voice that could speak this new architectural language. Jack stood forgotten at his podium, a statue in a spotlight. A cold dread, colder and deeper than any he had ever felt, was creeping up his spine. He knew with a sickening certainty what was coming next. Desmond smiled warmly. "We found that voice not in London or Tokyo, but right here in New York. A visionary whose work, though not yet widely known, is some of the most thoughtful and innovative I have ever seen." It is my profound honor to introduce the lead creative consultant and chief architect for the Hawthorn Wing, Ms. Autumn Langford. Autumn, would you join me? Every light in the room seemed to shift. Every eye in that hall, 1,000 pairs of them, swiveled from Desmond Hawthorn and landed like a physical weight on Autumn. She rose from her chair with a grace that seemed impossible. The emerald of her dress seemed to catch and hold the light. She walked towards the stage, her steps measured and sure. She was not the ghost from his past. She was the architect of his future ruin. As she ascended the small set of stairs to the stage, she passed him. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. Her presence was a judgment, a final, irrefutable verdict on the life he had built and the one he had tried to destroy. She joined Desmond at his lectern, turning to face the now stunned and madly applauding audience. And on the other side of the stage, Jack Gallagher, the Predator, the master of the universe, stood alone at his podium, his speech forgotten, his mindset shattered. He opened his mouth to continue, but the only thing that came out was a deafening, horrifying silence. Time seemed to warp in the grand ballroom. For the audience, the moment stretched into a few seconds of awkward, compelling silence. For Jack, it was an eternity in hell. The applause for Autumn was a roar in his ears, a physical assault. He watched her stand beside Desmond Hawthorn, a portrait of serene power. The spotlight that had been his now seemed to be shared, its brilliant beam split between the established king and the new queen he had just crowned. Jack was left in a half-light, a figure suddenly peripheral to the main event. His brain, usually a ruthlessly efficient machine of calculations and strategies, was short-circuiting. The words of his speech, which he could have recited in his sleep, vanished. The teleprompter screen in front of him might as well have been blank. All he could see was her face, illuminated and triumphant. "You're a sensitive soul, my love. I couldn't bear to see you get hurt." His own voice from that terrible morning echoed in his memory, a mocking phantom. He had deleted her work to keep her small, to keep her safe within the confines of his world. He had tried to prevent her from failing on a small stage, and in doing so had handed her the world on the grandest one imaginable. The irony was a physical acid in his stomach. He tried to reboot his system. Just speak, say anything. But his throat had constricted, a knot of pure primal panic tightening around his vocal cords. He could feel a bead of sweat trace a cold path down his temple. The room was hot, suffocating. 1,000 pairs of eyes were on him, no longer with admiration, but with a morbid, pitying curiosity. They could smell the blood in the water. The predator had become the prey. He saw the camera flashes start, not the respectful pops from the press line, but the sharp predatory glints of cell phones from the tables. They were capturing this. They were documenting his unraveling. His hand, which had been resting confidently on the podium, began to tremble. He gripped the edge, his knuckles turning white, as if he could physically hold himself together. He opened his mouth again, a dry, croaking sound escaping. It was the sound of a man drowning in plain sight. Across the stage, Autumn saw it all. She had planned to feel a surge of triumph, a moment of karmic satisfaction. But watching the man who had been the singular architect of her misery completely fall apart, she felt a surprising hollow ache. This wasn't a victory, it was an exorcism. The powerful, terrifying monster from her past was being revealed for what he always was, a fragile, insecure man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of other people's subjugation. Desmond, sensing the shift in the room's energy, put a gentle hand on Autumn's arm. He leaned into his microphone. "Perhaps we can give Mr. Gallagher a moment," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the tension. "Autumn and I will be available to discuss the project in the West Atrium." It was a masterstroke of social grace and quiet devastation. He wasn't just dismissing Jack. He was rendering him utterly irrelevant. He was changing the channel. As Desmond and Autumn turned to leave the stage, Jack made one last desperate attempt to reclaim control. He reached for the microphone in its stand, his movements clumsy. His trembling hand fumbled, knocking the heavy object from its clip. It fell to the stage with a deafening thump crack that echoed through the ballroom sound system like a gunshot. That was the final blow. The sound broke the spell. The whispers in the audience erupted into a full-blown murmur. His assistant, Peter Face, pale with horror, rushed onto the stage, followed by 2 event security guards. They flanked him, their presence a public declaration of his incapacity. "Mr. Gallagher," Peter said in a low, urgent hiss. "Sir, let's go." Jack looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of judgment and morbid fascination. He saw Beatrice Vandergrift whispering behind her hand. He saw Robert Calloway shaking his head with a look of undisguised contempt. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was a public execution. His brand, his reputation, his meticulously crafted illusion of invincibility, all of it had evaporated under the heat of a single spotlight. He allowed them to lead him off the stage, his steps unsteady like an old man. As he passed into the darkness of the wings, he chanced one last look back. He saw Autumn standing at the edge of the stage watching him go. There was no hatred in her eyes, no glee. There was only a profound, heartbreaking pity. And that was the most damning judgment of all. The empire he had built to impress the world had crumbled at the feet of the one person whose worth he had never been able to see. The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was a tidal wave of noise and motion. As Jack was guided from the stage, his exit a slow-motion tableau of disgrace, a palpable shockwave rippled through the assembled elite. The carefully constructed veneer of high society decorum cracked, then shattered. Voices rose from hushed whispers to a frantic, unrestrained clamor. People were on their feet, their faces a mixture of astonishment, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled schadenfreude. The flash of cell phone cameras was relentless, a constellation of tiny, cruel stars capturing the fall of a titan. Through it all, Autumn stood as if in the eye of a hurricane. The roaring in her ears felt distant, muffled. She was only vaguely aware of Desmond at her side. His presence a calm, steady anchor in the swirling vortex of drama. A museum staff member, a woman with a discreet headset and practiced urgency, appeared at Desmond's elbow. "This way, Mr. Hawthorn, Ms. Langford. We have a quiet exit for you." Being led through a series of hushed, anonymous corridors behind the grand exhibits felt surreal. One moment she was the newly crowned architect of the city's most anticipated project. The next, she was slipping out the back like a fugitive. They passed a gallery of Roman statues, their marble faces impassive, their silent judgment 1,000 years old. They had seen empires rise and fall. The public humiliation of one arrogant man was but a blink of an eye to them. They finally emerged into a small, secluded courtyard, a hidden lung in the massive stone body of the museum. A single wrought iron bench sat beside a gently burbling fountain. The door clicked shut behind them, and the cacophony of the gala was instantly silenced, replaced by the gentle splash of water and the distant, mournful siren of a New York City ambulance. The cool night air, crisp with the promise of late autumn, felt like a clean cloth wiping away the stuffy, superheated atmosphere of the ballroom. Autumn walked to a stone balustrade and gripped at the chill of the rock seeping into her palms, grounding her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first she felt she'd truly taken all night. For a long, contemplative moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was necessary a space for the echoes of the evening to finally fade. Autumn stared up at the sliver of starless indigo sky, framed by the towering buildings of the Upper East Side. She had replayed a scene like this in her mind 1,000 times over the years, a moment of reckoning of justice. In her fantasies it was always fiery, triumphant. She had imagined herself delivering a scathing remark, watching Jack crumble and feeling a surge of fierce, righteous satisfaction. But the reality was hollow. The overwhelming emotion she felt now was a profound, aching quiet. "I didn't expect that," she finally said, her voice barely more than a whisper, the words seeming to dissolve into the night air. "I thought I would feel happy, vindicated, but I just feel quiet." Desmond moved to stand beside her, not crowding her, but offering a silent solidarity. He followed her gaze to the sky. "Vindication is a noisy emotion, Autumn. It's a firework, a loud, brilliant flash that quickly fades, leaving just smoke. What you're feeling is peace. It's the slow, steady light of dawn. It's much more valuable." He turned his kind, perceptive eyes to her. I must confess this evening's dramatic turn was not entirely a surprise to me. Autumn looked at him, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "What do you mean you couldn't have known he would fall apart like that?" "No, I could not predict the specifics of his implosion." Desmond admitted a wry, gentle tone in his voice. "But I have found that structures built on rotten foundations tend to collapse under pressure. I merely provided the pressure." He paused, letting her process his words. "I may have had an inkling of how tonight might unfold." "I don't understand," she said, genuinely puzzled. "My foundation has a small but very diligent investment arm." Desmond began to explain, his voice calm and methodical. "Their purpose is not just to grow our endowment, but to do so ethically. A few months ago they flagged some troubling patterns emanating from a firm that had grown very large very quickly. It was Apex Dynamics. Their trading strategies were beyond aggressive. They were predatory, designed to create instability for their own gain. It was all risk, no soul." He continued, "I am a great believer that a person's character is a single, indivisible thing. A man who is unethical in his business is rarely a saint in his private life. So I began to look into Mr. Gallagher himself. And that is how I came across your name, Autumn, not in headlines but in the footnotes. You were a ghost in his origin story, credited only as his supportive wife during the years his first major investments took root." Desmond's words were painting a picture she had only ever seen from the inside. To hear it articulated by an outsider, by a man of his stature, was strangely validating. "I have a passion for architecture, as you know. It led me to seek out your student work, your early competition entries. The designs were brilliant, full of life and a deep sense of humanity. Then I saw the work you did while you were married, and I could see the slow strangulation of that unique voice. The soul was being stripped away, replaced by a cold commercial viability. I saw a talent being suppressed, and I made it my business to find out why. When I learned he was to be the keynote speaker tonight, I saw an opportunity for a certain poetic justice. I wanted to give you a stage, Autumn. I just didn't realize he would so willingly cede his own." Autumn was speechless. This entire life-altering evening was not a stroke of luck. It wasn't fate. It was a quiet, deliberate act of benevolent intervention by a man who had seen an injustice and possessed the power and the will to correct it. He hadn't just offered her a commission. He had orchestrated the restoration of her narrative. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness for what she had lost or of pity for the man who had just been ruined. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude for being finally truly seen. "Why?" she whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "You didn't know me. You owed me nothing." Desmond's expression softened. "I knew your work," he said, his voice imbued with a simple, unshakable sincerity. "And it spoke of integrity, of light, and of a belief in building a better world, not just a bigger bank account. That's the kind of person I invest in, Autumn. That is the only kind of legacy worth building." The next morning the world felt different. Autumn awoke in her own bed in her own apartment to the soft morning light filtering through the large loft windows. For a moment the events of the previous night felt like a fever dream. Then she picked up her phone. It was the lead story on every news outlet. Gallagher's Gala meltdown. Apex CEO freezes on stage as ex-wife announces landmark project with billionaire Desmond Hawthorn. There were grainy videos of Jack's face, slack-jawed and pale. There were crystal-clear photos of her and Desmond, a study in calm dignity. The stock of Apex Dynamics had plummeted in pre-market trading. The articles hinted at an imminent SEC investigation into their trading practices. Jack's empire, built on the predator's mindset, was being devoured by the very jungle he celebrated. Her own phone was a frantic chorus of notifications. Emails from major publications, Texts from old colleagues who hadn't spoken to her in years, and a dozen voicemails from a breathless representative at a top talent agency. Langford Designs was no longer an obscure two-person firm. It was the name on everyone's lips. Later that afternoon, after sending a brief polite text to her 2 employees telling them to take the day off and that she'd have incredible news for them tomorrow, Autumn finally found a moment of silence. She stood in the center of her loft, the scent of coffee and paper, a familiar comfort. This space was the antithesis of the Park Avenue penthouse. It was warm, personal, filled with books and sketches and thriving plants. It was a space that nurtured rather than displayed. She looked out her window at the Manhattan skyline, that iconic, jagged line of steel and glass that represented so much raw ambition. For years she had felt dwarfed by it, an insignificant spectator to a world built by men like Jack. She had been taught to believe she was too small to ever add to it. But now her perspective had shifted. She saw not just the imposing towers, but the gaps between them, the pockets of air and light, the potential for something new, something more human. She was no longer just looking at the skyline. She was about to change it. Her past was a ghost finally laid to rest in the rubble of a fallen stage. Her future was a set of blueprints waiting for her to draw the first bold line. And for the first time in a very long time, the page was beautifully, thrillingly, completely blank. That night at the gala wasn't just the end of Jack Gallagher's story. It was the powerful beginning of Autumn Langford's. It's a raw, gripping reminder that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout your own success, but about the quiet resilience you build in the shadows of adversity. It shows that karma sometimes doesn't wait for the next life. It arrives on a public stage under the brightest spotlights for the whole world to see. Autumn's journey teaches us that your past does not have to be your prison. You can be the architect of your own future, and sometimes the most magnificent structures are the ones built upon the foundations of a life you had the courage to leave behind. If this story of karmic justice and rising from the ashes resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share it with someone who might need to hear that their own new beginning is just around the corner. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of drama, resilience, and ultimate triumph. What are your thoughts on Jack's public downfall? Let us know in the comments below.